Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we're joined by Yotam Perkal. Yotam, thanks for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to chat with you. I was reading some of the research from you and your organization, and that's how you got on my radar. But for folks that don't know you or your team, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So, yeah, I'm Yotam. Currently lead the vulnerability research at a startup cybersecurity company called Resilient, based in Israel. Actually, the southern part of Israel, not Tel Aviv, as most probably startups that you guys got a chance to interview people from. What we do is we basically accelerate software supply chain security and vulnerability management by helping organizations focus and prioritize risks, focus on what matters. So, and personally for me, after my military service, not in IT, I was an infantry officer. Then I got into, did a degree, started from software automation, and then through software development and into kind of data science and security research. Prior to Resilient, I worked at PayPal at the security product center, dealt with vulnerability management, threat intel, insider threat, and fraud detection. Yeah, and I'm trying to be involved in the cybersecurity community. I take part in several OpenSSF working groups around open source security, as well as the CISO work streams around S-BOM and VEX, and yeah, that's basically it.
Awesome. I didn't know the involvement in the S-BOM and VEX stuff, and I didn't queue up any S-BOM questions for you. So now I'm kind of kicking myself because I should have. So I wanted to ask you though, like you got on my radar because I came across this report you guys did, Resilient and Ponemon did around vulnerability management and the state of kind of vulnerability management, and in that report. It found that the average organization, I think it was that you surveyed, had over 100,000 vulnerabilities in their backlog, which anyone who's worked in vulnerability management knows that is a pretty daunting amount of vulnerabilities to try to burn down. So I'm curious, like based on your research and your experience as a practitioner too, why do you think it's gotten so bad that organizations are just drowning in this many unremediated vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so I think that there are a few contributing factors. I think that the main thing is the entrance of DevOps, and like the world that we're living in. Most of the code that's running in your production environment isn't code that you wrote. It's whether it's commercial tools or third-party software, which is open source. But so on one hand, it enables the business to run fast and focus on the core business logic, and you can deliver faster. And we probably wouldn't be where we are today if that wasn't the case. But on the other hand, this comes with risks, and this only kind of escalates as time goes by. And we are all, even vendors are also part of the supply chain because of that. So even as a vendor, you use open source software, you use libraries, you don't write code from scratch. And as I said, this gap will only grow wider over time. And I think that currently there is a lot of the current paradigm for vulnerability management is very manual, and that's also something that it can't keep up with the rate of the newly introduced vulnerabilities. And more software is being written, and software will always have bugs, and yeah, so that's just kind of the lay of the land.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And in the book that I just finished up, which focused on software supply chain security, I talk about the pervasiveness of open source software and the vulnerabilities associated with that, with both direct and transitive dependencies and things like that. As you said, it accelerates the business, but it also accelerates that backlog of vulnerabilities that we're just talking about.
And you touched about also S-BOM, and I think S-BOM is kind of like a double-edged sword in that sense, because people know more now about what they have in their environment, and with more visibility comes more noise and more things that that you need to address, and that's also a contributing factor.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in the sense that, we've seen tremendous adoption of open source software, and it's not necessarily a situation that the vulnerabilities didn't exist. We just didn't have that level of transparency. Now we do, and it's like, oh, wow, there's a lot of problems here that we weren't aware of,
Yeah.
So I want to ask you too, that report also touches on the fact that I think most organizations mention that they're only able to remediate or patch, about half or less than half, I think it was around 50, 53%, whatever it was, of vulnerabilities, that they identify. So obviously that backlog is just going to continue to grow. And it sounds like it's a situation that's ripe for malicious actors to come and exploit, this massive backlog of vulnerabilities. How are you seeing that play out in the ecosystem?
Yeah, no, it sure does. I think what we saw, we also did a few research around the prevalence of trying to kind of estimate the attack surface of old vulnerabilities, like vintage vulnerabilities from 2020 and before, and also the report that you mentioned. And we see that kind of what's arguably the easiest task in cybersecurity, patching a known vulnerability that has a known patch that that is exploited. Even that seems to be beyond the reach of many organizations. And I think it also has like several levels. I think some organizations don't even have the visibility or the tools or the processes in place to know that they're vulnerable. And then for more mature organizations, they're probably, it comes back to the gap that we discussed in the first question, that they simply don't get around to patching everything. And I think we'll probably discuss this in the future. There is also a lack of focus. You're not necessarily patching the right things. And again, with the manual aspect of triaging those vulnerabilities, and the shortage in skilled personnel, then it kind of all boils down to the fact that simply organization can't seem to keep up.
Yeah, there's I think lots of issues there, right? There's so many vulnerabilities that come out all the time. The complexity that we have in the organizations now, where you have, it's not like you're managing one OS or two OS levels. You're probably managing containers and lots of libraries and applications and tools, where environments weren't as complex before, even 10, 15 years ago. I wanted to switch gears a little bit because you have a background in both data science and security research, which makes a lot of sense, having some good background data science experience. Where do you feel like, sort of data science, security research, and even vulnerability management, they sort of come together? And do you feel like we need more data scientists in cybersecurity?
So maybe I'm a bit biased, but for me, I think it definitely helps the additional perspective. I think a lot of my views on vulnerability research and a lot of the research that I deal with kind of stem from the fact that I've seen the problem from various directions. First as a practitioner, then as a data problem, and then from a security research perspective. And I think that definitely helps. And I personally believe that in a wide knowledge, I like learning, and I like to learn a lot of things that not necessarily at first glance you think that maybe there's a connection, but then you come up with a problem, and then it's kind of like different tools in your tool set that you can apply to different kinds of problems. So I definitely think it helps, and I think we're starting to see also that a lot of organizations have that kind of dual approach into solving cybersecurity problems from a data science, machine learning perspective, and also for more security research oriented.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's such a, I totally understand that need for knowledge, but blending lots of different areas of expertise into what we do in cybersecurity or in vulnerability management, which is my favorite topic, by the way. I am so glad you're here today. But yeah, so I feel like in the research that I've done in vulnerability management, even in the last 5 to 7 years, there was sort of this dip in how much information we really had around vulnerability management guidance, or really talking about it. There was so much about cloud, and now we're talking about multi-cloud and machine learning and AI, and vulnerability management seems to get lost in the shuffle. Where do you think that this topic is really starting to pick up steam again, around vulnerability management? Why do you think that is, and where do you see it going?
So great question. I think it's really gotten to a point where people are starting to understand that the current way that we're doing things, the current paradigm, isn't scalable, and it also relates to some of the things that we discussed. But I think if in the old days the approach was patch everything, and then it got to okay, at least patch the highs and the crits, and then people starting to realize that not necessarily it's not scalable. That's one, and not necessarily it's the right thing to do even. And we need to shift kind of the paradigm to not patch everything, not patch what's high and critical, but patch what actually matters. And I think to understand what actually matters, that's kind of the challenge, and that's probably where the future of vulnerability management will go to, adding the context. So people are starting to understand and talk a lot about, and Chris, I've seen a lot of the content that you also put out, and you also, Nikki, discussed with your guest is around that area, because I do start to see a change in a lot of people kind of understanding the importance of context. And I think that's kind of the challenge. How do we take that to the ground level and start to apply it? Yeah. So and for that, I think automation will probably have to be the key for us to get there, to be able to get to a point where we have a more scalable vulnerability management paradigm.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I've felt very much the same way, that in the last, 10 years that we've sort of seen this dip in vulnerability management, information guidance, research, that things have changed so much. We have heavy development environments. We're using open source more, that things are so different even from the way they were 2 years ago. And so vulnerability management needs to be this, a lot more fluid than this sort of static thing that it's been for the last, several years. So security research is an interesting thing for me, because we sort of see it in two different ways, right? There's the security research that happens with vulnerability identification, and reports and things like that. And then we see it in academia. So trying to, sort of solve problems and looking at things in a different way. Where do you think that maybe some of the security researchers or academia, do you think they're working well together? Do you think they should be working better together? Where do you think we're at with that?
So I think the interesting things, the synergies, the cool things happen when the two sides kind of combine and work together. I think EPSS is a good example for that. The expert prediction scoring system, and it started out as more of an academia kind of research. Obviously, first kind of drove it, but with a combination of work that is being done in the academia and in practice, and the watching the evolution of it is nice in that context, because I think it's driven by the field. So if the first model of EPSS only had like 16 features, kind of like a basic logistic regression kind of model. Now we're talking about a version 3 that recently came out, which is based on XGBoost and has over 1,100 features. And the improvement that they state over version 2 is 82% improvement. So I think that's kind of a good example of the kind of projects that I do start to see more of kind of the academia and the industry joining forces and working together.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and EPSS is a good example. We talked about, that backlog of vulnerabilities, and you talked about automation and the need for context. Someone dropped in the comments, patch everything. That sounds great, but we have lots of things and not
Yes.
many people and cognitive, bandwidth to do it. So I think automation is going to play a critical role, along with coupling it with providing context and letting people have visibility into either known exploited vulnerabilities, as you guys talked about in your research around CISA's known exploited vulnerability list, or probable exploitations, for example, with EPSS. So, I want to ask you too. We saw, I think it was your research or another company similar that I saw that, essentially, the NVD has grown from, a few thousand CVEs in the 1990s to like 190,000 or 200,000 plus now. So this is also an example of why patch all the things is a little bit tricky and not so simple. Why do you think we've seen this growth of CVEs in the NVD? For me, I think it's like obviously the pervasiveness of software has grown, the security research is growing, people are just paying more attention and looking for these things, and we have more visibility, as you talked about. But I'm curious to hear your perspective on that growth.
Yeah, so I think it's exactly that. And as I said earlier, this gap will only grow wider. It's not something that is going to close. We see the trend, and we have more software. Systems are more complex. We have more visibility into that software, so we know more, and that gap will only grow wider. And I think, as you said, and also some of the research that we put out focused around that, exploitability is a really strong signal, because if only a fraction of the vulnerabilities is being actually exploited, and a fraction of those vulnerabilities are exploitable in the context of specific environments, then if you had like a magic 8 ball that will tell you focus on these vulnerabilities alone, then in terms of risk reduction, you'd be in a much better place. And I think that is, again, something that is key for vulnerability management to kind of advance to the next level of getting this context. And I think exploitability based prioritization is definitely the future where we should go. And it has like several layers. So does the CVE has a known exploit? That's one. What's the probability of that exploit to be exploited where, for example, we have EPSS? And then is it already known to be exploited? And then you have things like CISA and threat intel that can tell you that. And then the last layer, I think, is can it be exploited in the context of my environment? And then it really gets interesting. And then you have tools like Resilient that can tell you, okay, 85% of the vulnerabilities don't even have code associated with them that is loaded to memory. And then if it's not running, then no one can exploit it. So you reduce that, the likelihood of exploitation. And again, you can focus on the 15% that do matter. After it's kind of like a decision tree. You go through all these layers, and at the end of the day, you get this funnel where you have less. I wouldn't say you have less to worry about, because again, obviously, ideally, you'd want to patch. If you have security vulnerabilities, you'd want to patch them, but at least start with the ones that pose the most risk.
Yeah, you kind of stole my thunder on the next question I was going to ask you, which is about prioritization. And I think you're spot on. We're seeing a maturity of, going strictly from higher critical CVSS scores to understanding that, hey, just because it's severe or critical or high doesn't mean it's actually exploitable or poses real risk. So is it known to be exploited? Is it probable to be exploited? What about the asset criticality? Like, what is the system, the data that the system is processing? Do we have mitigating controls in place? And as you talk about, you start to see it formulate into a decision tree, which reminded me of CISA's stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization system. But obviously that, takes thought and it takes cognition from people. So I think that, I think where we're seeing innovation happen is like around the automation piece. So since you stole my thunder on the prioritization topic, I wanted to open up the can of worms around S-BOM and VEX, just your thoughts on where that's going when we look at, getting visibility of open source software use. Not only that, but suppliers providing things like a VEX to tell you like, here, there are all these vulnerabilities, but here's what's exploitable. Here's what's, concerning, for example. So I wanted to throw that out to you.
Awesome. So for me, I'm really passionate about this topic. So I'm glad that we got it to talk about that aspect as well. And I think it ties back to what we discussed um, up until now, because in the end of the day, we need, as an industry, a scalable way to answer the question, am I vulnerable? And currently, triaging vulnerabilities, because of the amount of noise, also scanners are not magic as well. And the people that, there's a point that people often kind of neglect, but every vulnerability scanner is an S-BOM tool by itself, because in order to know what vulnerabilities you have, you basically you have two basic stages. You need to know what are the software components that exist in an environment, and then you take the information that you got from the environment and map that against security advisories to know whether that components that you found are vulnerable. And if you have problems in any one of these stages, then the results you get will be suboptimal. So if a scanner fails to detect a certain software component, which is this S-BOM capability, which it wasn't designed to do, so we see a lot of gaps there, but then it won't report vulnerabilities in that software element. So I think, going back to your question, so how do we answer, am I vulnerable, in a scalable way? So I think, and as I said before, currently triaging vulnerabilities because of the amount of noise is really a challenging task. So you have people kind of, getting a list from their security tool telling them you have these 300, 1,000 vulnerabilities, sorting them by CVSS score and starting to go one by one and see whether they're applicable or not. And then out of the list, only a fraction end up being applicable, but the process is tiring and, again, not scalable. So I think two things. First, CSAF, which is kind of a way for vendors to make the security advisories machine readable and digestible by security tooling. So if now when you have a vulnerability in a product, then the way that the vendor will let people know is either in their site, or it can be in a PDF form, it can be in an HTML form, it can be a text file, and there's no common schema that is machine readable and can be digested by security tools. So CSAF, I hope, will change once it gets more adoption, will change that aspect, and then you can automatically know. The vendor simply, instead of you reaching out to the vendor and saying, hey, are you vulnerable to this vulnerability that just popped out? And what should I do about it? You simply have your vulnerability management tool digest that information automatically and can then issue a VEX, which tells you that, all of these vulnerabilities are not relevant because the vendor says that they're not relevant for him. And then again, you get into these layers, and I think the future of VEX, and this is where I see the automation playing a key role, is that a lot of the focus on the talk around VEX is from the supplier end. So the supplier can tell you whether a specific vulnerability is relevant for their product, but I think where it will get more interesting is from the consumer end, because then if you have a security tool that can tell you, all these vulnerabilities are not relevant, and automatically update the VEX for them from various justifications. The code isn't reachable, the configuration required for exploitation isn't in place, so the vulnerability is irrelevant. And then you have a network oriented security tool that can update the VEX based on the fact that that machine isn't reachable from the network, and that vulnerability can only be exploited from the network. And then you have all these tools that can talk together and kind of update the S-BOM with the VEX information, and again, letting you automatically start with much less to deal with and triage. So that's my, at least, vision for for the future of vulnerability management.
Yeah, I want to jump in with a quick comment. I like where you went with the vision because, as you noticed in the beginning, from the supplier's perspective, they're providing me a VEX and they're self-attesting that this isn't vulnerable. One, I have to hope that they've done their due diligence and that they're competent enough to tell me. And two, that they're being honest and transparent, because if revenue is on the line, they may want to make things look better than they are. So having tooling that can do that on the consumer side is ideal. Otherwise we enter that self-attestation versus third-party attestation death spiral that we've seen play out in compliance space. So I really like that vision you laid out.
And I think, and even, the final layer can be even, your own security personnel that tells you, okay, I did the work and I'm telling you this vulnerability isn't relevant because XYZ, and manually update the VEX for it. But then when you, as an executive, you want to get a view of your entire environment, you have all this information fed in, and then one kind of pane of glass to see what's your applicable attack surface, and not just all that huge amount of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I can tell you're super passionate about this, and you know a ton about this area, because I totally agree. I think that's certainly the future of vulnerability management, right? Is one, the automation, right? Adding that piece into it, so you're automatically getting this updated information. And then two, I think adoption is going to change over time, and we'll see the benefits of using it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a chicken and egg kind of thing, because unless it will gain wider adoption, it will be tricky to get to that point. So I think that's one of the challenges as an industry to drive that adoption, because if no one issues VEXs and no one thinks that it's important to get to a point where all security advisories are machine readable, then we kind of stay where we are.
Yeah, keeping that manual review process in place and trying to do the triage and everything. Well, before I take us to our last question, I wanted to ask you sort of like what's going on at Resilient, what are you working on, where can people find you, anything that's going on that you wanted to share?
Cool. So so we're as I said, we're based in Israel, but we are kind of global in terms of our customer presence and machine what we aim for. We do a lot of the things that I mentioned. We try to do it and kind of drive that front of future vulnerability management. One of the things that we do is, as I briefly mentioned, is we analyze the runtime, and we know what code is actually running, and then we map that to software components. And then once we have a vulnerability, we are able to tell you if there is any code in your environment that is related to that specific vulnerable component. And obviously feeding a lot of threat intel, the things that we discussed, CISA and EPSS, etc. So that's basically it. And for me personally, the research front is what mostly focused on. So hoping to get a more interesting research thrown your way in the next kind of couple of months. And I do think it's important. One point that I do want to say is, I think it's really great to see, or I'm starting to see at least, there are a lot of people that are passionate about this field, and they're starting to talk with each other. And I think collaboration is really the key, and kind of it's not one vendor will solve it, or one guidance, or one policy. The entire industry has to work together. And if anyone else is passionate about research in this field, I would love it if you kind of reach out, and I'd love to collaborate. So, and again, thank you for inviting me on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Listen, we're talking vulnerability management, S-BOMs, VEX. I mean, Chris and I are like we're both like loving this. So that'll take me to our last question, which is, based on your experience with data science, security research, vulnerability management, software supply chain, what does cyber resilience mean to you?
So I think if the kind of common thread around this talk was automation, so I'll take it to that direction. So I think we need automation in order to and try to reduce the manual toil in order for us to be able to focus the human aspect, be able to free him to focus on the more kind of high level thinking and making sure that once we have if I'll take the rubber band metaphor, so we stretch it, we want it to go back to the original state. So in order to get back to the original state, we really need to free out our resources and have them focus on what matters most. And then for that, I think automation is super important, as well as in terms of the mindset to be more proactive and not responsive or reactive, to get to a point where you can anticipate the risk and prepare. Yeah. So.
Yeah, perfect. I love it. I love the rubber band methodology there. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Yotam, for coming on and talking with us all things vulnerability management. We got to talk about S-BOMs and security research and everything in between. So thank you so much for joining us this week. That's going to take us out for this week, and we'll see everybody next Friday.
Well, thanks a lot.